Hello and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, it's a pleasure to be joined by you on a Friday evening. Are you excited about RFK Jr. getting a well-deserved promotion?
You know what? The worm in my brain is absolutely going nuts about it. So if he's happy, I'm happy.
The worm in your brain is feasting with joy. Coming up tonight, leading climate experts warn COP isn't fit for purpose. Heartbreaking Sky report from northern Gaza and some interesting data on what cost the Democrats the US election. We're going to ask if the left, us guys, if we're all dangerously out of touch. We don't duck the tough questions on this show. It's been a wild ride of a week for cabinet appointments in Washington, and we're coming to you yet again with another controversial selection from the president-elect Donald Trump.
Mr. Trump has also selected his former rival, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's well known for his vaccine-skeptical views, to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. Mr. Trump made the appointment, or rather the announcement, on his Truth Social platform, saying Mr. Kennedy will restore agencies to the traditions of gold standard scientific research and beacons of transparency to end the chronic disease epidemic and to make America great and healthy again.
MAGA, Make America Great and Healthy Again, or MAGA. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ran for the White House as an independent before dropping out in August to endorse Trump. He reportedly approached both the Harris and Trump campaigns for a potential role in government and has been rewarded by Trump with a tap for the top health job. Now, the nomination needs to be confirmed by the Senate, but as Health Secretary, Kennedy would oversee America's National Public Health Agency, that's the CDC, the Food and Drug Administration, so that's the FDA, and operations of the Affordable Care Act, Medicare and Medicaid. RFK Jr. is a member of one of the most famous political dynasties in the United States, and that's as nephew of John F. Kennedy, so JFK, and the son of his brother, Bobby, who ran to be president but was assassinated before he could stand. He's also one of the most high-profile anti-vaxxers in the world. Here's Bobby Kay on Bill Maher's podcast in 2023.
On the side that shows that autism is caused by vaccines, there's over 100 studies. I, in fact, did a book in which I listed all of those studies and digested them, in other words, summarized them all, and you can go and source them.
So RFK's position on the MMR vaccine and autism, now that was actually a somewhat respectable opinion in the 1990s, right? There was a widely cited article in The Lancet in 1999 suggesting a link between that vaccine and autism. The problem for RFK, though, is this. 2 decades have passed since then, and every study ever since has said there is no link. And this is even more important. In 2009, it was revealed the original paper in The Lancet had been fraudulent. The Lancet paper was ultimately retracted, and its author, Andrew Wakefield, was struck off as a medic in disgrace. So why hasn't RFK Jr. updated his priors? Well, it seems he doesn't swim in the oceans of mainstream science. Instead, he picks up crackpot ideas from the fringes, like this claim about COVID last year.
COVID-19, there's an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and Black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese.
Very strange claim. I haven't seen that anywhere else other than coming out of his mouth. I mean, Israel did very well at dealing with the outbreak, but that was because they had a lockdown and very good public health services. And we know what China did, right? They had a very aggressive lockdown. Seemed completely bizarre, really, really wacky, and obviously feeds into some quite racist conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of people say this was invented as a bioweapon by the Chinese. I think it maybe came out of a lab. I don't think it was a bioweapon. It definitely wasn't a bioweapon that was targeted to kill people who weren't Chinese, and then you can throw in Jews there because they appear in most conspiracy theories. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. chairs anti-vaccine advocacy group, the Children's Health Defense, and that was founded in 2019. What a time to found an anti-vaccine organization. To be one of the top 2 funders of anti-vaccine ads on Facebook. Now, Children's Health Defense and was also one of the major spreaders of anti-vax misinformation in American Samoa. Here's Kennedy being interviewed in the 2023 documentary Shot in the Arm.
Do you have any idea of how many cases of measles were in Samoa between, say, 1986 and 2019?
I have no idea.
Great, okay, I've got that. 1986, 1 case of measles, 93, 7, 2005, 0, 2006, 0, 2009, 0, and in 2019 there were 5,707 measles cases. Do you know what happened in 2019?
Yeah, I'm aware there was a measles outbreak, but I didn't have anything, I had nothing to do with people not vaccinating in Samoa. I never told anybody not to vaccinate. I didn't, go there for any reason to do with that.
One News has learned of a high-level anti-vax meeting just before this deadly measles outbreak, a meeting between vaccination critic Robert Kennedy Jr. and anti-vax blogger Taylor Winterstein. Publicising her meeting with the high-profile Kennedy as profoundly monumental for her movement.
This so-called anti-vaxxer, Edwin Tamasese, he had promoted the use of vitamin C to cure the disease.
During the country's 2-day mass measles vaccination drive last week, he posted, "I'll be here to mop up your mess, enjoy your killing sprees."
But the government is fighting back.
Edwin Tamasese is now under arrest, charged with incitement against a government.
He's like a wacky fringe guy who's had some really damaging effects, right? If he had anything to do with people stopping getting vaccinated in Samoa, then that, as you saw from that graphic there, that cost a number of lives. Kennedy, has also questioned the idea that HIV causes AIDS. He sort of said, this is no one's been able to prove this. He's also suggested that a herbicide in water causes gender dysphoria in young people. Now, it's interesting, sort of this nomination, because Donald Trump's one undeniable success in his first term was Operation Warp Speed. Now, that's the government program which essentially threw money at the drug companies to help them produce COVID vaccines more quickly. And that might make RFK Jr. seem like a strange bedfellow. But in the run-up to the election, Trump said he would let Kennedy, quote, go wild on food and go wild on medicines. Here's Trump speaking to Kennedy on the phone in July.
Really, you man, something's wrong with that whole system.
Yeah.
And, and it's the doctors you find. Remember I said I want to do small doses. Small doses. When you feed a baby, Bobby, a vaccination that has like 38 different vaccines, and it looks like it's meant for a horse, not a 10-pound or 20-pound baby. It looks like you should be giving a horse this. And do you ever see the size of it, right? It's just massive. And then you see the baby all of a sudden starting to change radically. I've seen it too many times. And then you hear that it doesn't have an impact, right? But you and I talked about that a long time ago. And anyway, I would love you to do so. And I think it'll be so good for you and so big for you. And we're going to win.
Wow. So we can see that Donald Trump does seem to dabble in a lot of these anti-vax views. Kennedy has said the Trump administration, quote, won't take vaccines away from anyone. But his nomination has been rightly slammed by professional medical associations and doctors. It's worth saying there are a couple of issues where RFK Jr. isn't obviously wrong.
With a stroke of the pen, you can change back the rule that allows pharmaceutical advertisers to do direct-to-consumer ads on television. That's one of the big problems. That's why one of the reasons we have this entrenched agency capture, not only of Congress, because they control the airwaves, they control the evening news. 75% of the revenues for those evening news shows for, Anderson Cooper is coming from Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies. So, and those companies are dictating content on those shows, and they dictate the official narratives. And they're able then to exercise huge control over Congress. So Congress is terrified of them. But with a stroke of the pen, you can say this is not good for the health of our country, which it isn't.
So the US is one of the only countries in the world to allow pharmaceutical companies to include product claims about efficacy while marketing products directly to patients. We don't have that in this country, which is a good thing. In the United States, advertising rules were loosened under Bill Clinton's administration, and that was followed by a complete explosion in spending by drug companies over the next decade, from $1 billion in 1997 to over $5 billion in 2006. So this is, he's identified a real problem there. And there are also other issues where I immediately thought his opposition sounded completely cranky. But then after looking at the evidence, it seems that Bobby Kay might not be as out of step with the science as he at first seems. This is from Dr. Leanna Wen in the Washington Post. So she writes, RFK Jr.'s views on fluoride aren't as crazy as you might think. And in the piece, Dr. Wen says there are actually a number of studies showing a link between ingesting high levels of fluoride and lower IQ. And in fact, most Western European countries have already ended the practice of adding it to water. So when we hear sort of his number one priority is going to be to take the fluoride out of the water, well, it does actually seem like that is one where experts are divided. They're not divided on MMR vaccines. So let's not get confused there. They're not divided there. They're not divided on the COVID vaccine. But on fluoride, on the power of Big Pharma to advertise to people, these might be sort of little kernels of truth in what he's saying. Also, he's named overly processed foods as a threat to Americans' health, which is, clearly probably true. To find out how RFK Jr.'s nomination is being received, I spoke earlier today with Oliver Barnes, a US pharma and biotech correspondent for the Financial Times.
Like a lot of the nominations that Trump's made, he's kind of been saying in the days leading up to it being announced, like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And everyone's been like, is he going to do it? And with the Health and Human Services appointment, there was a lot of speculation it might go to a kind of more adult in the room, kind of mainstream candidate as such, someone like Bobby Jindal or Ben Carson. And then he did what he said he was going to do. He let RFK go wild on health, as he said during the campaign. I think the reception to it splits across a few lines. From Republican senators, they seem quite at peace with the idea of, voting in favor of his nomination. However, the majority that they have in the Senate is only 3. So it doesn't take many to dissent from that to potentially block that nomination. And then on the other side of stuff, in terms of like biotech leaders, drug makers, because of his record of opposing or showing skepticism about vaccines, spreading a kind of unfounded conspiracy theories, promising to kind of tear down the public health establishment, there's understandably quite a lot of kind of concern in industry about what this means. And we've seen today that a bunch of kind of stocks in vaccine makers and drug makers have traded down as a result.
How powerful is this job? Obviously, the health secretary in the UK runs the NHS, like very, very powerful job. The health secretary in the United States, you don't have an NHS over there. Presumably, it's not the case that sort of RFK Jr. could get appointed in this role. I know you said it's dependent on the Senate, but if he does get confirmed in this role, it's not the case that he could say, okay, I believe that that these vaccines cause autism, the MMR one that he believes causes autism, isn't it? So we'll just stop doing those. We'll ban these vaccines and people will no longer have them. Is that something that would be within his power?
He has said in interviews in the past couple of weeks that, if people want to take vaccines, he doesn't want to do away with them. So he's not actually like explicitly supported some outright ban. But the reaction to it is obviously when you have someone who's such a vocal vaccine skeptic in this role, obviously it causes a degree of concern. It's different to like the UK health secretary role, but it's still very powerful, right? So in the most direct sense, the HHS role, you manage a $1.8 trillion budget, most of which goes through spending on drugs through Medicare and Medicaid, which are like government-backed health insurance programs here in the US. And, I think maybe something that people have overlooked a little bit is if you kind of combine RFK's positioning on the pharmaceutical industry with the suggestions that like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to push for like huge efficiency cuts in government, you might see a scenario in which like government spending on drugs is reduced, perhaps. But then the other element that, comes with the role of like running this department is that it has 13 divisions under it, 10 of which are some of the agencies we became used to during the pandemic, right? Stuff like the Food and Drug Administration, which, approves medicines, and the Centers for Disease Control and Protection, which is like the big public health infectious disease monitoring agency. And the FDA, the current FDA commissioner, Robert Califf, was doing a speech in recent days and basically acknowledged the HHS secretary can overrule a lot of stuff within FDA. And that's someone from the very top of the establishment at the minute, basically saying the role that Bobby Kennedy's being put into will give him, to some degree, kind of carte blanche to direct, drug policy in the US. I think the bigger question is like whether or not Trump longer term gives him carte blanche, right? Trump does not like sharing the spotlight with people.
Trump isn't really an anti-vaxxer, right? That's one of his big achievements was Operation Warp Speed. So it does seem like a strange sort of an alliance of convenience to some degree. I want to pick up on something you said sort of about sort of the pharma industry being a little bit concerned about RFK. Now, of course, on one element, we're going to be with the pharma industry in the sense that sort of spreading vaccine skepticism is not a particularly healthy thing. But there's also a degree to which, American pharma companies aren't exactly a sort of image of functionality and good behavior, let's say. So some of the critiques I've heard from RFK Jr. of the pharma industry in the United States do seem, that sometimes he's got a point, right? He says sort of they shouldn't be directly advertising to the public when it comes to drugs. I think he wants to negotiate down their prices. Are there elements where putting this sort of somewhat strange outsider into that role could have some upsides?
On that first point you make, I think it's a good one, actually. It's super intriguing, like how Trump has pivoted on this. And he was the guy who delivered the COVID vaccine. And now he's let, its biggest, one of its biggest opponents and skeptics, run the US Health Department. In the way of some of those kind of reforms that the RFK's talked up, I mean, talk is cheap, right? One of the things he makes a big deal about is the food system. He talks about how the US healthcare system is inadequately set up to tackle chronic disease. He's taken, actually, as an example of that, this new class of weight loss drugs, which is set to be like the biggest medical product ever, basically. And he said, why have we got a scenario where private insurers and government is set to spend tens of billions of dollars on these drugs, but we're not spending money on, overhauling the food system in America, which contributes to obesity in the first place, right? And I think most people from across the spectrum would say that's a completely reasonable point of view. We had Emma Wormsley, the CEO of GSK, at one of our FT events last week, and she was saying, yeah, I endorse the idea of make America healthy again, right? In fact, if you look at the current FDA, they have big plans, under Biden, they had big plans about overhauling the way we approach additives in food in the US. It's not easy to do, though. And one would imagine that in the grand scheme of the Trump administration's priorities, actually healthcare ends up falling quite low down, the priority list. And doing these kind of big systemic long-term things is very difficult. And while RFK is kind of called for bigger, ambitious overhauls of the healthcare system, of the way in which we approach food, way in which the US approaches food, there's also a whole load of people within the administration who are more in the camp of kind of deregulate, pro-business, pro-big pharma. So how that shakes out, I think, is completely unclear at the moment.
If anyone is sort of watching this thinking, why are we talking about the United States Health Department? We've got enough problems in the NHS over here as it is. I suppose, could you speak to how this could matter for the rest of the world? And I suppose I include RFK Jr. in here, but also, I suppose, Donald Trump's approach to science more generally, to science and health. I mean, we could throw in climate there, but sort of the kookiness that seems to be front and center when it comes to his cabinet appointments. How could that impact people outside of America?
I saw a statement this morning, for instance, from Andy Pollard, who was one of the guys behind the Oxford COVID vaccine that was developed with AstraZeneca. And I think he touched upon exactly the kind of wider ramifications of this, which is there's someone now in a very influential public health role in the US who has indulged in some very kooky and fruity conspiracy theories about vaccines. And, it's not that long ago that we were having infectious disease breakouts and bacterial infections spreading like wildfire. I mean, like decades ago, like within a century, we've gone from like this being a massive issue to we have it under control. And it's completely possible that we could lose control of that if these kind of conspiracy theories and somewhat unfounded claims that RFK expounds, gain traction. And when you have someone who gives oxygen to those in a very influential role, that can have huge impacts far beyond the borders of the US. And you just look at like the kind of role he played during the pandemic, right? He basically became a kind of cult hero for people all over the world who sowed doubts about COVID vaccines to gather behind. And he said some, frankly, quite outrageous stuff. He said COVID was the deadliest vaccine ever. He's played into this link between MMR and autism, which has been completely disproven. And he also said COVID as a disease was ethnically targeted to spare Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people and affect Black people and Caucasian people. I mean, these are like all kind of baseless claims. And yeah, he now has a pulpit, a platform for those that he certainly didn't have before he was appointed to this position.
One thing I think you can make what might be called a conspiratorial critique of the US health establishment, Fauci, for example, is that it did seem like they sort of quashed the lab leak theory for COVID before it was, I still don't think it has been debunked. It seems like it's very much an open question where it came from. Did it come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or did it come from a natural source? But that doesn't seem to have been a big campaigning issue. It's almost sort of like COVID's just been forgotten. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the pandemic had a massive effect in a weird way on this election. I mean, number one, like a lot of the inflation that probably caused, people to vote in favor of Trump stems from, the COVID spending. But then if you think about what Bobby Kennedy did, he lent his kind of bolus of support to Trump when he dropped his independent campaign in August and flocked in behind Trump. A lot of the people who were kind of behind Kennedy's quite kind of libertarian, somewhat populist campaign were people who were drawn in by like COVID conspiracies. And so in some way it's not been there directly, but it's cast a shadow over it for sure.
That was Oliver Barnes speaking to me earlier today. Now, something I think about a lot on this show is that with the news, you're generally telling people about what's going wrong in the world, what risks there are. You tend less often to sort of talk about what's going well. Vaccines, I thought, let's take the opportunity to see how we have progressed as a society. This is a chart I saw shared on Twitter today, which I quite liked. I think it's from the CDC. Comparison of 20th century annual morbidity and current morbidity of vaccine-preventable diseases of children in the United States. So it shows you how many died from each of these diseases until the vaccine was approved and became widespread. So smallpox, 48,000 people a year used to die. Now it's 0. Diphtheria, 175,000 people used to die a year. Now it's 4. Well, when I say now, 2,000. Maybe it's even less now. I don't know. Measles, 500,000 people used to die a year. In 2000, it was 81. Mumps, 152,000 used to die. Then it was 323. Pertussis, don't know what that is. But as you can see, all of these, lots and lots of people were dying. Now, barely anyone is. And for some of these diseases, completely 0. Obviously, smallpox is the only disease we've ever sort of eradicated from the whole world, which was a good job. Good job done well. Ash, what are you thinking about RFK's nomination after that interview with Oliver Barnes?
I think that there's a real danger in focusing on the really legitimate criticisms of RFK Jr. when it comes to things that he said about vaccines, things that he said about the connection between HIV and AIDS. Also, the allegation of sexual assault, which was lodged against him by a former babysitter. Those are all really, really important criticisms. But for me, the crucial thing is to look at, well, why is it so many people supported him in the first place, and why he's been able to do the sort of neither left nor right thing, which has attracted a lot of disaffected people to him, because the issue is bigger than him as an individual. I mean, you talked about some of his legitimate criticisms of the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, one of the things that he's been consistent on calling out, campaigning on for a really long time, is the fact that there is this horrendously close relationship, a revolving door effectively, between the regulators and the corporations that they're meant to be regulating. So there was one study which followed 16 medical examiners who worked for the FDA. 11 of those 16 went on to work for big pharmaceutical corporations, in some cases for corporations that they'd been directly responsible for regulating. And in a particularly famous, notorious case, one of the individuals who was part of the team which signed off the use of OxyContin for, pain relief use, not just being prescribed to patients with cancer or terminal illnesses. He then went on to work for Purdue Pharma, who were the manufacturers of OxyContin. So what you have is this relationship between corporations and pharmaceutical companies, big corporations, and the regulator, which has had an absolutely catastrophic impact on the health of Americans. I mean, the signing off of OxyContin for pain use, chronic pain use, or kind of normal pain use, normal-ish pain use, I think is single-handedly responsible for the synthetic opioid crisis in the United States to this day. And that's the kind of thing that RFK Jr. has campaigned on for a long time. Similarly, he's talked about the very weak regulations around food production in America. I mean, there are things which are allowed in American food which are not allowed in Britain or in Europe for very good reasons. And that, combined with the lack of healthcare access, is part of the reason why you've got this huge gap in health outcomes along the lines of class. And it was really striking to me. I was listening to JD Vance's interview with Theo Von, who's a podcaster. And what he was talking about was the fact that there is a life expectancy gap, I think it was of 7 years, between those with college degrees and those without college degrees. Now, that is a massive part of Trump's messaging, right? Looking at things through the lens of class, looking at the fact that, there have been a lot of, sacred cows for liberals, which have been well intentioned, but haven't I think adequately spoken to the life experience of lots of working class people in the United States. Working class people have some very good reasons to be skeptical of the FDA. Now, that's not me defending RFK Jr. That's not me defending anti-vax ideology. I'm very pro-vax. Give me every vaccine going. I absolutely love them. But it's just sort of pointing out that there's a danger, I think, in even us as an organization, looking at things that more liberal centrist press are saying, and running with that as the story, and neglecting, I think, the material reasons for why he's become such a powerful political figure in the first place.
I mean, has RFK become that? I mean, obviously he has become a powerful political figure, right? He's been nominated to be the most powerful person in health in the United States. So he is powerful. But I don't think the majority, he wouldn't have won an election, right? I mean, I suppose Trump did. I suppose these people aren't marginal anymore.
Well, I mean, look, he wouldn't have won the nomination by himself, but I think what he did do, and what Trump recognized, is that he brought people over who may not have ordinarily voted for Trump. There's some really interesting stuff that he said earlier in his career, where he talked about environmental pollution. And he said, look, environmental pollution and poverty, these things go hand in hand. Poverty is the softener for, for environmental pollution. And these are not things that you would have expected to come from a Trump ally, certainly not 2016, 2020. So I think the fact that Trump made overtures to a man like RFK Jr., the Democrats said, no, we want nothing to do with you because of the anti-vax stuff. I think that shows the way in which the Trump campaign has adapted, the way they've really, really honed in on their messaging around class. That's not necessarily going to be reflected in the policy, but that's absolutely their single-minded vision when it comes to the messaging. And a way in which I think, again, it's like Democrats, you might think that these are really good boundaries to set, right? Whether it's anti-vax ideology, whether it's transphobia, whether it's racism or anything else. But Democrats have these barriers, but they go, well, we're not going to touch you, right? We're not going to touch a guy like you. But the fact is that he's got a constituency, is able to speak to a constituency that feel alienated and abandoned by the Democrats. It's not necessarily the really wacky stuff that's appealing them either. And when you say, I don't want anything to do with you, it's also heard, I think, by people saying, well, you don't want anything to do with us either. And that's a really tricky thing to navigate. I'm sure we're going to talk about it more later in the show, but I think that's one of the single biggest issues facing the Democrats as a party.
COP29 is in full swing in Azerbaijan's capital of Baku. But key climate policy experts have published an open letter to the UN saying the conference is no longer fit for purpose. The letter is signed by former UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, former UN Climate Chief Christiana Figueres, and former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson. And it says this: COP's current structure simply cannot deliver the change at exponential speed and scale which is essential to ensure a safe climate landing for humanity. This is what compels our call for a fundamental overhaul of the COP. We need a shift from negotiation to implementation, enabling the COP to deliver on agreed commitments and ensure the urgent energy transition and phase out of fossil energy. The letter suggests 7 measures for reform. These include banning countries who don't support phasing out fossil fuels from hosting COPs, shifting from negotiations to concrete action, which they say could be achieved by more regular and smaller COPs or with more sort of specific goals. They also want to increase mechanisms for holding countries accountable for their progress towards climate targets and to promote greater recognition of the link between poverty, inequality, and the climate emergency. This year's COP is meant to focus on supplying the funding to help poorer countries cut emissions and adapt to the impact of extreme weather. So The Guardian say that top economists have found that poorer nations need $1 trillion a year by 2030 in climate finance. That's to cope with climate breakdown, and it's needed 5 years earlier than expected. But in their letter, leading climate policy experts warn, quote, a growing proportion of climate financing pledges are now being dispersed as interest-bearing loans. So this actually increases the debt burden for climate-vulnerable nations. The letter also highlights the shocking number of fossil fuel lobbyists granted access to COP talks. Over 1,700 lobbyists. That's a lot of lobbyists for the coal, oil, and gas industry got passes for COP29, outnumbering delegations from almost every country in attendance. So you've got the negotiators for the United States, negotiators for China, they've got the negotiators for fossil fuels, and they're just as big as everyone else. The open letter comes after a headline-grabbing speech from host country Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, earlier this week.
It's a gift of the gods. Every natural resource, whether it's oil, gas, wind, sun, gold, silver, copper, all that are natural resources. And countries should not be blamed for having them and should not be blamed for bringing these resources to the market because the market needs them. The people need them.
That's such a funny thing to say at a COP, right? The whole point of this is to say, how do we wean ourselves off fossil fuels so that we can combat the climate emergency? And then the president of COP, president of Azerbaijan, and they have the presidency of COP, stands up and says, you know what? These are natural resources. You've got oil, you've got copper, you've got silver, you've got wind. Don't blame us for using it. Which is not necessarily the message that was supposed to be put forward at that event. The choice of Azerbaijan, it goes without saying, as host is a controversial one. Here's the world's most famous climate activist, Greta Thunberg, protesting the conference from neighboring Georgia.
COP29 is being held in Azerbaijan, which is a repressive occupying state, which have committed ethnic cleansing and which are continuously cracking down on Azerbaijani civil society, and are now trying to use this COP29 as a chance to greenwash their crimes and human rights abuses. 2024 is on track to become the hottest year ever recorded, and last year global greenhouse gas emissions reached an all-time high. In this moment that the UNFCCC is hosting yet another COP climate meeting in an authoritarian petrostate is beyond absurd.
According to Human Rights Watch, Azerbaijan has intensified its crackdown on journalists over the past few years, and Azerbaijan's authorities extended the pre-trial detention of at least 11 journalists from the country's remaining independent news outlets ahead of COP29 starting. A number of those detained were investigating reports of corruption and pollution, while others were critical of Azerbaijan's record on human rights and carbon emissions. This follows, of course, COP28 being hosted by another major fossil fuel producer, the United Arab Emirates. Ash, I feel like I need to research this, because is it an accident that the COP seem to just be hopping from one fossil fuel mega producer to another? Like, why is it the case it was in UAE and now it's in Azerbaijan, and it's going to be, where's it going to be next? It's sort of like Russia and then Venezuela and Iran. It's sort of like, why are we hosting these in the big fossil fuel producers, or the biggest fossil fuel producers of the world? Although actually, to be honest, America is now the biggest fossil fuel producer in the world because of fracking. But anyway.
I mean, look, I've got a theory about this, right? So 1, you take a repressive petrostate. 2, that petrostate hosts a Formula 1 Grand Prix. It gets added to the F1 calendar. 3, can't be long, they're going to host a COP. I mean, I think that it's part of a whole load of things. It's about normalizing relationships with other states. It's about, sort of trying to find the line of how much human rights repression you can get away with before people cut you off entirely. There's an element of greenwashing. I understand the argument. That in order to achieve global political buy-in for decarbonisation, one of the things that you have to do is get the engagement of oil and gas producing countries in the global south who are wanting to economically develop. Like, I understand that argument, but I don't think that's why Azerbaijan is up for hosting a COP. Same with the UAE. I think it's part of a global geopolitical PR strategy.
I suppose with this letter, I can see where it's coming from. I always worry when people say we can fix this by just sort of changing the nature we do these COPs. I mean, I suppose that what they're saying is we should make them smaller and more regular, which is probably smart. So let's tackle this issue by issue instead of having these big set piece things every year where sort of thousands of lobbyists and thousands of negotiators sort of all get together and don't seem to agree very much. But it was the case that for a long time, one of the reasons the climate negotiations sort of came to a bit of an impasse is because they were trying to say, we're going to sort of divide the amount that each country can emit in a fair scenario whereby we get down to zero emissions, or I think at the time they were sort of trying to reduce emissions by 80%. And that was a very honourable ambition, right? That is what we would have done as sort of this sort of rational, fair world system. But the problem was it didn't work. The powerful countries would never sign up to it, because why would they sort of allow this multilateral system to dictate what they can and cannot emit and what their industries can do? So it ended up sort of, it was a nice idea, but didn't work. And the real breakthrough actually, when it came to these international negotiations, was saying, okay, screw the whole, you have to sign up and limit your sovereignty thing, which was the sort of Kyoto model. Let's just say you come forward every year and you tell us what you're going to do, right? And we accept that this multilateral organization isn't really going to be able to dictate to China or America what they're allowed to do. Let's try and encourage the development of technology so that this can be, fairly reasonable and not that difficult for anyone. As you know from regular viewers of this, I think it's important to see climate change as how do we develop the technology, which means it's not incredibly expensive to do this transition, because I think the politics is always very difficult to solve, potentially impossible to solve. I think the election of Donald Trump is just another reminder of that. But it does actually seem like there's some fairly sort of pragmatic, reasonable suggestions in this letter from the former General Secretary of the UN, as you would imagine. Sky News have published another powerful report on how the people of Gaza are being forced from region to region under the constant threat of airstrikes.
The airstrikes come without warning. For some, it's enough. Time to leave again. The constant move to the promise of safety, which doesn't exist. They mostly walk in silence. Women and children watched by Israeli tanks and struggling under the weight of whatever belongings they can carry. Some can barely face it. They've lost the energy to keep fleeing a war that has no front line. In the panic to escape, these children have lost their mother. A sleeping baby has also been separated from her family.
This girl was with her grandmother, an elderly lady. Her grandmother dropped her. We don't know who she is. All we know is how to help each other. So we are waiting here in hopes that her parents will come and take her.
This is the safe zone they have been sent to. The airstrike on Wednesday morning left a huge crater. It is no wonder that so many don't feel like this is a better alternative to life in the north.
We don't know where we have to go. Seriously, there is no safe place to go to. No safe place, so we don't know. Seriously, we have nothing. We lose everything we have.
It's a really powerful report, and just so, I think it's that juxtaposition of seeing what seems like, I mean, obviously being separated from your parents in that kind of situation is completely appalling. You don't know if you'll ever see them again, right? But it reminds me of, when I was a toddler, sort of not being able to find your mum in a supermarket. It's the kind of thing that one can relate to, even if the horror is completely incomparable, right? And then you get just that airstrike on a bunch of tents, and it's just something completely out of my sort of realm of knowledge or experience or existence. It's just both of those sort of being side by side. It's just so, I suppose, painful to watch. Of course, making Gaza unlivable is not an accident. It's part of Israel's plan, and that has long been made explicit in the so-called General's Plan. Now, this was put forward by retired General Giora Eiland. He's the guy who famously, towards the beginning of this war, said that it wouldn't be too bad if pandemics or epidemics were to spread throughout Gaza, because then that might make people leave sooner. The General's Plan calls for the expulsion of Palestinians from the entirety of northern Gaza and of the forced starvation and targeting of whoever stays behind. Eiland spoke to Sky.
What we should have done to tell all the remaining 400,000 civilians that they should leave this area. Even the competence of Hamas, everyone should leave. But after 2 weeks, I will stop the supply of food, fuel, and other, important material. And this is the most effective way to conquer the northern part of Gaza without killing civilians, because all those civilians by that time will be out of this area.
And if they can't leave? Or if they don't want to leave?
I'm saying I will not begin the siege before I see what is happening with the civilians.
And what if Hamas will leave? Then what do you achieve?
Now I have a real leverage that might force you to release the Israeli hostages. Because if you don't do it, I will not evacuate this area.
We have verified this video of an Israeli drone strike near the coast. The people watching, believed to be soldiers, laugh as one of them sings the final countdown. Israel denies that there are plans to reoccupy Gaza, but bulldozers are destroying what few buildings are left standing. Northern Gaza is steadily being emptied, and any memory of life here eradicated.
Northern Gaza is steadily being emptied and any memory of life eradicated. That were the words from the reporter there. I think very clearly evidenced by the report. That's not just his opinion. And to me, that sounds like the textbook definition of ethnic cleansing, right? You're clearing everyone out and you're making the place unlivable. Right? That's ethnic cleansing. When it comes to legal definitions, ethnic cleansing and legal definition, when it comes to legal definitions in international law, the UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine has expressed severe concerns about our own Foreign Secretary, David Lammy.
You may have seen a few weeks back, David Lammy, our Foreign Secretary, was asked in Parliament a question about whether he would describe Gaza to be a genocide. And he said the scale of the killings was nowhere near a genocide. So he dismissed it outright. How is genocide defined, and how would you respond to Lammy's?
Excuse me, I can't believe that. He's a lawyer, isn't he?
Yes, a human rights lawyer.
All right. I'm surprised because the first instinct of a lawyer would be to look at the legal documents, the jurisprudence, and probably David Lammy has to explain to the public where did he read that is the number of people killed who define genocide. Probably David Lammy should read Article 2.4 of the Genocide Convention, which refers to an act of genocide that doesn't even involve the killing of one person.
Really?
Or the fifth. I mean, there is genocide through forceful transfer of children. And this is how the genocide in Australia has been mainly perpetrated, and including in Canada. So this is why I insist on the settler colonial framework. Yeah. While David Lammy is not the only genocide denier, I think that it's particularly serious when it comes from someone who has a position of authority, who carries an even greater authority because he's a man of law. But excuse me, what constitutes genocide is established by Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, not personal opinions. And it's the intent, the determination to destroy a group in all or in part through several, even one only of these acts, killing, infliction of severe bodily or mental harm, and creations of conditions of life which would bring about the destruction of the group. And look at Gaza today. Gaza has been destroyed. Most of the civilian infrastructure, arable land, all universities, the civil registry, the National Archive, the historical and religious, cultural heritage of that place, the medical infrastructure, all universities, all schools. How does David Lammy call this? Is it a war? I'm very concerned because this is not a war. If this is a war, we are entering a new stage where war doesn't respect anything that has to do with civilian life. And this is to be pushed back. So whatever ignorance exists there, it can be resolved with a good reading of what genocide is and how it has been commented on and developed as a concept through international jurisprudence.
That was Francesca Albanese, the UN Rapporteur for Palestine. Ash, I suppose, what more is there to say on this?
Well, I suppose just pointing out the obvious, the reason why David Lammy and Keir Starmer are point blank refusing to call what's going on in Gaza a genocide is because they are on the record having supported many of these Israeli measures which collectively punish the Palestinian people and which have led to the awful number of deaths that we're seeing. Going right to the start, when, right after October 7th, Israel cuts off food, fuel, and water. You've got first Keir Starmer and then Emily Thornberry saying, I think Israel does have that right. You've got the continuation of arms licenses. Now, some of them have been suspended, but David Lammy specifically insisted on a carve-out for components which go towards making F-35 jets. Many of these airstrikes that we've seen, which have killed Palestinian displaced people, sheltering in sometimes, schools, that those have involved F-35 jets. When you look at the sanction measures brought in by David Lammy, You've had just a handful of settlement outposts being subject to sanctions. There are more than 100 illegal settlements, which constructed by the Israelis in the West Bank, which also enjoy the protection of the Israeli state and Israeli army. You've got the government of Israel hosting events, their party, Likud, hosting events calling for the settlement of Gaza. The IDF have said that Palestinians won't be allowed to return to the north of Gaza, right? That is forcible transfer. That is a war crime. And I think when you look at the attacks on humanitarian aid convoys, on hospitals, on infrastructure, when you look at the targeting of children by snipers, when you look at the destruction of health facilities, these all meet the definition of genocidal acts. Now, it's not that David Lammy is bad at law, doesn't understand what the law is. It's not that Keir Starmer doesn't know what the law is regarding genocide. It's just that if they were to say, okay, yes, this is a genocide, even if they were to say, all right, this has gone to a certain number of deaths where we can finally admit it, that would be admitting their own culpability. And that's why they deny the facts in front of their face. And if I sound upset, it's because I am, because I think there's something so disgusting, morally cowardly about how Labour have been over the entire course of this war. The reason why they went all in for Israel right after October 7th is because they were scared of being called anti-Semitic. That's the reason why, right? They were like, well, we don't want to suffer the same fate as Jeremy Corbyn. That's why we're not going to call for a ceasefire at the beginning. That's why we're not going to say you can't collectively punish the Palestinian people like this. That's the only reason why they did it. It's for pure, naked political advantage domestically. And now that's gotten them to the point of they can't admit that a genocide is a genocide. And there's something more repulsive to me about saying this and not even really believing it. Right? Saying it because you want to save your own political skin. For me, that's more disgusting than meaning it.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of our audience will share that emotion. I suppose we just haven't heard much from Labour about this now. I mean, beyond them saying we're gonna stop exporting some arms parts, but not all of them. Like, it's the kind of weakest thing you can possibly propose. Almost a fortnight after Trump was elected for a second time, analysis of how he won is still running in overdrive. Now, that I think makes perfect sense. His first win in 2016 upended our ideas of what was politically possible, what people could vote for. But back in 2016, it could be put down as a fluke. His 2024 win, of course, can't be dismissed in any kind of similar fashion. That means there's more sort of deep thinking going on after this one. And after the election this year, there is a big difference with 2016. Back then, all the talk was about a divided America in which the big cities had swung to the Democrats, but it was rural and post-industrial towns that had swung to the right. This year, though, it's been different.
Donald Trump, you can remember back in 2017, the liberal cities were the resistance, the core of the resistance. What happened in 2024? You think of a major city in the United States, Donald Trump put up the best Republican performance for a Republican nominee for president in at least 20 years, if not the entire 21st century. We're talking about Chicago, Los Angeles, New York City, San Francisco. Across the map, Donald Trump put up historically strong numbers for Republican candidate, for president, in places that, truthfully, if you had asked me 8 years ago, I would have never thought possible.
No, I mean, it is really stunning. So what exactly is driving it?
What's driving it? I think immigration, one of the things you mentioned earlier on in that last segment, is part of it, but I think crime is a big part of it as well.
Yep.
If you look at Gallup polling and you ask Democrats nationwide, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with our efforts to control and bring down the crime rate? What you see is the dissatisfaction number now versus a decade ago. Look at that. The unsatisfied number from 35% to 58%. The satisfied number dropped by 20 points. My goodness gracious. And I think that's part of the reason why you have seen these liberal DAs be ousted in places like San Francisco, in places like Alameda County, in places like Los Angeles. The crime rates have simply moved a lot of these voters to the right.
And look, obviously we're sitting here in New York,
yes,
talking about this in Manhattan where there was a swing. But when you look at a map of New York City, biggest city in the country, the big swings right, yes, it was in Manhattan, but it was also in other parts of the city. And that gives you a real sense of who it was driving the ship.
Yeah, exactly right. It was in the Bronx, it was in Queens, it was in Brooklyn. And if you break it down by racial areas, right, you look at the assembly district that has the most Asians in it, you see a massive shift. A massive shift. Look at this. Donald Trump gaining 27 points versus where he did 4 years ago. The highest Hispanic percentage in an assembly district, a 25-point shift. Highest black percentage for an assembly district, a 6-point shift. What's going on is if 2017 or 2016 was the election of the white working class moving over to the Republican ranks, the 2024 election was Trump doing historically well with minority voters.
I mean, it is really incredible. And those numbers say...
They're amazing.
They're amazing. I mean, they are. If that doesn't give you pause, if you're a Democrat looking at this world, I don't know what will.
It is really interesting and really different to 2016. I think it's completely transformed how people are talking about this. Because in 2016, it's sort of, how do we change the mind of these white working class people in rural Pennsylvania? And now it's like, okay, well, why don't people like the government they've had for the past 4 years? Now, again, we've been saying ever since last Tuesday, part of this is just that incumbents have been punished because of inflation. It would make sense that would be something which impacts people across race and gender lines because inflation affects everyone. So that's partly what we're seeing. But it does also seem like, potentially America isn't as divided as it was. It just doesn't like the liberals as much as it used to tolerate them, or maybe they've changed. We're going to talk about that in one moment. One of America's leading liberal voices gave this analysis of why the Democrats have fallen back in cities.
I come from outside Los Angeles. I lived in San Francisco until 18 months ago, and I live in New York City. The thing that surprised me least about the election was the sharp red shift in these big cities. Because if you just talk to anybody who lives in them, they are furious. And this idea that oh no, the economy is actually good or crime is actually down, or this is all just Fox News, shut the fuck up with that. Talk to some people who live near you. The rage I just hear from people in New York, this is partially Greg Abbott busing huge amounts of migrants here, but that does mean, by the way, there are enough migrants that Greg Abbott could bus actual human bodies to New York City. And it was a big enough problem that New York City was not able to effectively deal with it, right? It does show that what was going on the border was much worse. I think the Democrats were letting themselves accept for all the cruelty of what Abbott did there. That was not like an ad campaign. Those were actual people who had come into the country who were overwhelming border states. The sense of disorder rising, right? Not just crime, but homeless encampments, trash on the streets, people jumping turnstiles in subways, crazy people on the streets. You just talk to people and they're mad about it. They feel it's different than it used to be. I mean, in San Francisco, the fury is overwhelming. And you see that it's not just the presidential level. London Breed, the SF mayor, just lost re-election. In Oakland, they recalled the mayor. A bunch of the progressive DAs across the country were recalled or beaten in re-election campaigns. If Eric Adams has a lot of problems, but if he were obviously on the ballot, he would almost certainly, it seems to me, lose. You have to be able to govern well. People don't follow politics, but they live in the place they live. They see if prices have gone way up, and a bunch of economists telling them, no, don't worry about the price of everything. At least for some people, and maybe net, a slight majority of people, real wages have modestly outpaced inflation is not going to do it. Because people feel when they get a raise, that's them. And when prices are going up, that's you, the government.
I thought two things worth noting there. So that's Ezra Klein, very sort of leading, very thoughtful, liberal voice. And he's basically sort of saying at the beginning there that sort of liberals have underestimated the amount to which people in their cities, they notice things sort of increasing. I mean, in America, it's this unique situation where you've got lots of people crossing the border in the South and then Republican governors busing those people to northern blue states like New York. And then Ezra Klein saying one of the reasons why people might have shifted to Trump in New York is because they're seeing that this causes an element of dysfunction, similar with people seeing crime around them, which is something that's often dismissed by progressives. I was trying to think if this completely applies to the UK, because I can't, I know lots of people do get angry at Sadiq Khan, but I don't think there's the same sort of situation whereby I suppose that sort of progressive polarization is just a sharper degree in America than it is here. Obviously, you wouldn't get Sadiq Khan talking about defunding the police, but you did get a few sort of local authorities and city councils in America talk about it. So it went a little bit further there. In terms of which party has left the center, we often talk about it saying that, the right has gone off the deep end. Lots of people now say maybe it was the left after all. A new article by John Van Murdoch in the Financial Times, he suggests that while we were talking about Republicans shifting to the right, it was Democrats who on some issues were the ones that, if you just look at the charts, it looks like they were the ones that radicalized. So on the left here, you can see what proportion of the public support affirmative action. For the median voter, it's barely changed between 1996 and 2020. So you can see support from the median voter is always quite low. It's gone from just under 20% to just over 20%. Support among people who identify as strong Republicans has declined slightly, so not too much of a change, but it has declined. But support among Democrats has massively increased, right? So meaning people who identify as strong Democrats are much further from the median voter than strong Republicans are on this issue. It might be different with different issues. On the right, you can see how strong Democrats used to be closer to the median voter on immigration, but they went strongly to the left from 2012 onwards. Strong Republicans moved slightly to the right, but not by much. So again, you've got a situation where the median voter is much closer to people who strongly identify as Republicans than people who strongly identify as Democrats. Murdoch also puts forward data which suggests that progressives are not just out of touch with the median voter, but also, and this is important, with the minority groups they claim to represent. So on the left here is the proportion of different groups who think legal immigration to the US should be made easier. So I suppose the grouping is a little bit interesting here because you've got whites divided and then people of ethnic minorities not. But you've got among white progressives, 80% agree with that statement that legal immigration should be made easier. Among Hispanic and black voters, less than 40% agree. On the right, so I'll look to the right chart now, it shows you how different groups think about police. So asked whether the size of police forces and the scope of their work should be cut, just below 80% of white progressives agreed. Among Hispanic support was just a little over 20%, so way, way lower. Among black voters, it was just under 40%. Ash, was it the left that sort of abandoned the median voter and the mainstream to a greater degree than the right over the past few years, and we've just been kidding ourselves that it's the other guys who are the extremists?
Well, I'd say yes and no. The first thing that I'd say, particularly about the immigration graphic that you showed up from John B. Murdoch there, is that you have to be just a little bit cautious, because what that does definitely show you is how strongly, strong, solid Democrats felt about wanting more immigration, right? And it shows you Republican voters kind of staying where they are, right? Strong Republican supporters. What that doesn't really tell you much about is the content of the kind of immigration policy that they want. So what you might have is you've got lots of strong Democrats saying, okay, we want to make the process of claiming asylum easier. We want to make the pathway to citizenship easier, but that doesn't mean open borders. Similarly, there's a difference between Republican supporters saying, okay, we want to bring down the levels of economic migration, we want to bring down the levels of undocumented migrants then getting citizenship, and all the way to I want mass deportations, I want whole families being rounded up and sent away, I want raids on workplaces. So I think that there's sometimes a danger in taking a graphic like that and saying, this is going to tell us everything. All right. What will really show you how far apart people have moved is their support for the concrete policies. That's just my take on it. But when it comes to things like, I guess, the impact. So there's an ecology within the left, right? And so you've got like a very radical flank, and then you've got a sort of pressure and influence which gets exerted to the center, right? And I think that part of the reason why that happens is because that very radical flank of the left, which I would say I am a part of, I've been a part of, that's often quite dominant or powerful or influential at universities. Right, like that's the kind of leftism that you engage with, and that's a way of thinking which people take with them, kind of all the way, through their lives sometimes. And so I think that's how I think positions which are relatively marginal can exert greater force within big parties like the Democrats than you think should be than they should relative to their size amongst the population. I think it's about where people encounter these ideas and then where they take them to. I'm not against people holding minority opinions. I hold a load of minority opinions. I hold a shit ton of minority opinions. I just think that there's sometimes a danger in when you hold a minority opinion, presenting it as though you're speaking on behalf of a whole demographic, when that's not true. And I think that you see this particularly when people who are in favor of defunding the police or going further, police abolition, when I've seen it lots of times in the area where I live in Tottenham. I'd see lots of people who are radicals, more middle class, often white, but not always, saying, well, police enacts racist violence. We are speaking on behalf of a working class community of color when we say we don't want cops here. We don't want you in our neighborhoods. We don't want you here. Now, when you talk to a lot of working class black and brown people in my area, that is not what they're saying at all. What they're saying is, I don't want you to racially profile us. I really don't like the way you treat my son. I hate the fact that every time he goes to school, there's like a 25% chance of him getting stopped and searched. I really, really hate that. I hate being treated unfairly by the law, but I want the protection of the law, right? I live in an area where there is a serious youth violence problem, and the parents of those boys, most often boys who are impacted, they're not saying we don't want the police. They're saying we want the police to tackle this issue while not racially profiling us. And that's a very different position. And I think that gets taken up as a bit of a banner by people, and that sort of complexity is not taken into account. And I think that that's why the left does have a reputation of not really listening, because sometimes it's true, people hear what they want to hear. And again, this isn't me saying don't hold minority opinions or don't fight for them, but I just kind of think that you need a degree of humility or sensitivity to how minority they really are, and I guess engage with it from the level of persuasion rather than crusading is maybe how I would put it. I don't know, does that make sense to you, Michael? I feel like I'm whiffling.
No, it makes a lot of sense to me. I suppose where I sort of stand on all of this is, like you, I'm very much fine with people holding minority beliefs. I hold a bunch of minority beliefs. I don't want to abolish the police, but I hold a bunch of even weirder minority beliefs that you sometimes hear about, geoengineering and the like. But on this issue, I suppose where I think the left has been dysfunctional and where it might have risen actually right to the top of the Democratic Party, because my position has often been, oh yeah, the left's got all of these dysfunctions, but it's these are students, right? Don't get too angry at people doing student politics and say this is going to bring down civilization, because it's not, right? But one thing that I think is dysfunctional on the left, which I've experienced, and I'm sure you have too, is that there are lots of people who I think have marginal beliefs, which is fine. I mean, when it comes to abolish and defund the police, I think they're wrong, but that's fine. We can have that debate. But I think there are a lot of people who expend their energy trying to raise the costs of people on the left not sharing their minority belief. So there's this sort of idea that, well, I want to abolish the police, so therefore the easiest people who I can sort of try and get to submit to my idea are people who are slightly closer to the center than me. And then the theory of change seems to be, if I persuade them, then the next stop is the general population. And I think actually what happens is, because, I experienced this during sort of like BLM. I'm not saying I'm a victim of anything, right? I'm saying this during BLM. If I ever tweeted something which was sort of like, are you sure we want to abolish the police? Like, I'd get so many people quote tweeting me and replying and responding that I wasn't like, oh, I'm upset, I'm being attacked. I was like, I'm not going to tweet that again. And I suppose what I think happens on the left is you get this incentive structure where if you say something sort of that's actually just a lot closer to the median voter, which is common sense to most people in all races, all genders, most people think that abolishing the police is a bit wacky. But if you're on the left and you say that, you're going to get a real earache for it. So you don't say it. So it's not the case that everyone has these minority beliefs on the left, but we have this weird system whereby you get kind of punished for expressing common sense positions, rewarded for expressing kind of wacky positions. And that, of course, means that the left is not very good at putting itself forward as a reasonable bunch of people to the general public. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean, I suppose one of the things that I was thinking about is, again, just thinking about things that I can see in my own community on a day-to-day basis, right? One of the things that I see a lot of directly in the area where I live is people who have got really bad substance abuse problems. All right. And you can tell that they've got really bad substance abuse problems. You can tell from how they look. You can tell from the sores on their arms or on their faces. And you can tell because there's a particular kind of cut through that I often walk through to get to the main road, because they're there taking crack and or heroin, sometimes in the middle of the day. Now, when you're there and you're seeing it, like, to be honest, if I'm walking past it and I'm by myself, as I often am, I do often feel a bit unsafe, right? I do often feel a bit unsafe. And it that feeling of unsafety, I think, is generalized, right? I think a lot of people feel that. And so the thing that I guess I would suggest to people is take the work of persuasion seriously, because one of the issues is that unless you take some of those that feeling of unsafety seriously and say, okay, right, we can have a discussion about what kind of policing, or what kind of care needs to be in place, so that these people can get the help that they need. Like, what are these broader causes which are driving this very visible problem of drug addiction in your community, before people can be open to the idea of, like, what kind of care system do we need. You kind of have to deal with their feeling of unsafety first. And I think that that's often a bit which people on the left, particularly when you're trying to say that we don't want the police to deal with that, is that a lot of people go, okay, well, you're just going to spend ages talking about another system which isn't going to get set up, and the means of dealing with this feeling of unsafety that I have, well, that's the police. And I think that that's something which isn't really engaged with. And I think that I think that the task of the left is to take persuasion really seriously. And one of the problems is that when you say, let's take persuasion really seriously, is that people go, well, I'm just going to say what I'm already saying, but louder. Or people go, oh, well, I'm going to say this thing, which is, I don't like billionaires, or I don't like landlords. I mean, if you sit in on focus groups, some of the things that people say about billionaires and landlords, I disagree with, right? But it's surprising, right? You kind of have this idea against, working class people aren't going to like billionaires. One of the things that comes up in focus groups is that they go, well, I think that people who work hard should be rewarded. Now, again, I don't think that billionaires work hard for their money. I think what they do is, they own stuff, they exploit labor, they skim profit off the top. But if I've gone in with this idea of, like, okay, well, I've got some ideas which maybe people don't find so popular, but I'm going to do this thing, right? And it's like, we go really, really hard on the billionaires. Like, unless you I think, like, again, sitting on some focus groups, talk to people who aren't you, people who are outside of your circles, you're going to find yourself consistently surprised that people don't think what you think they're going to think. And that's, again, it's not me trying to say, like, abandon these politics. It's me going, like, you cannot come up with a persuasive strategy in a bubble. And I admit I am someone who exists in a bubble. I exist in a big ass bubble. But I'm increasingly thinking that I need to seek out ways to change that. Otherwise, the politics that I really, really believe in are never going to be successful.
I mean, I think I would go one step further than you, because I worry when the takeaway is always pay more attention to persuading people. Because I basically, my approach has been less try and persuade people and have some humility. Like, for so many of the things I think, oh, maybe I'm wrong. I think actively seek out people who disagree with you on the proviso that you might be wrong. It doesn't mean you have to just be this sort of, you don't stake your position on anything. You're just sort of floating, saying, oh, it could be this, it could be that. Like, sure, have some basic political principles that you're fighting for. But I do think that, and this is actually, I think, massively absorbed the sort of NGO sector as well, where they're constantly talking about framing. So we've come from this position that police are bad, borders are bad, everything should be publicly owned. How do we improve our framing strategy so we can persuade people of this? And it's sort of like, maybe you do need to take one step back and discuss, are your priors here actually sensible? Because it might be the case that if you have a more diverse, pluralistic movement where people all feel comfortable saying what they believe, that you're going to come to a slightly different position. Because I think often the problem with what the positions the left come up with isn't that they're not expressing them well. So the position isn't very persuasive in and of itself, right? So I basically think that if there had been a more open and healthy way of talking about things such as abolish the police, probably it wouldn't have had the legs it did. Because frankly, I think it's a silly idea, right? I'm totally fine for people to express it or to have that minority viewpoint. But I think one of the reasons why the left sort of ran with that idea for such a long time is because people were browbeaten into not expressing sort of opposition to it. You saw sort of high profile figures like Li Fang work for The Intercept. And when he was a bit critical of the sort of riots that followed BLM, he ended up getting pushed out of that organization. So there really was a cost to not falling in line with some of these minoritarian views, which I think was a problem. And I don't think the thing that should be learned from it is just, we need to be more persuasive. I think it's maybe we need to be more open to other ideas in case we change our minds. I don't know. What do you think, Ash?
I think there's a lot of truth in that, right? And I guess for me, that is part of being persuasive, because I think one of the conditions of being persuasive is actual connection with someone else. And when you're actually connecting with someone else, you have to take the risk that you might be changed by them. Do you know what I mean? So you have to take the risk to go, oh, I've really absorbed what you said and maybe I'm wrong. And so that's the thing about persuasion, is that you set out to do it. But I think the only way in which you're really persuasive is if you're like really hearing somebody else, right? Not just sitting there waiting until it's your turn to speak, but really, really hearing them. And every time you do that, you take the risk that you're going to change something that you think, right? So I mean something quite specific when I'm talking about persuasion. I suppose one of the things that I'm wary of, and I wonder what you think about this, is that, you know, when you go back and you look at polling from the 1960s in America, desegregation polled horribly. You know, Martin Luther King polled horribly. The Freedom Riders polled horribly. They've obviously been vindicated by history. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, the problem. One of the problems with the left is that you can take any issue and go, well, I don't care if I'm unpopular, I'm on the right side of history. And that becomes a reason not to listen to people, right? So I'm not saying take it to the extreme of going, well, I'm always on the right side of history. But what do you make of all those examples, whether it's desegregation or the anti-apartheid movement, whatever, where, you know, polled really, really, really horribly?
So some of them, the polling I remember seeing, so things such as the Freedom Riders, we've talked about this on the show before, and I think activists are always going to be unpopular, and that's fine, because the job of an activist who really cares about their cause is not to make themselves popular, it's to move the dial on an issue. And so, you know, we talked about this when it comes to sort of Extinction Rebellion or whatever. I think, you know, maybe it ended up, you know, towards the end of it sort of being a bit self-defeating, but at the beginning, it was definitely the case that the majority of the public said, I hate these guys blocking the road, but they do have a point. And that's actually a perfect position to be in as an activist. That's a brilliant position to be in as an activist. I suppose when you're talking about the substantive policy issue, I don't know precisely where the polling was, but I mean, I take it's completely plausible what you're saying to me. I suppose then it's about what is your strategy. And I think, as far as I understand, I'm not an expert on it, but I think you can look at the gay rights movement here as well. There were many civil rights causes, for example, where a huge part of it was, we are going to have the argument, right? It wasn't, we're going to try and get this in by the back door and then browbeat people into accepting it. It's, we're going to go out there and we're going to have the argument that black people and white people are equal, or that gay marriage and gay relationships are just as valid as straight relationships. As far as I understand, I might be wrong, and I think social media has probably made a big difference here, but I'm not sure if it was the case that before, let's say, you know, gay marriage was legalized, for example, I don't think it was made a taboo before it was legalized to say it shouldn't be legalized, right? I think the idea was that you're trying to persuade people until it becomes a majority position. I might not be completely correct there, but I do think that we have moved to a position whereby people are less willing to have an open conversation about things because they want to say, I'm going to win by default because you feel uncomfortable stating your actual opinion. And I think that's, you know, and there were also, you know, things that people were pushing for in the 80s, which were bad ideas, and some of them didn't happen, right? So you can also look to different periods where people were pushed for something and they didn't achieve it, and sometimes it's good they didn't achieve it. So, I mean, I think your synthesis was really good there, actually, Ash, in terms of, you can come to it with a sort of idea of wanting to persuade people. Because I used to be much more of an activist. Now I'm just a journalist. So I'm actually quite happy just plodding through the world thinking, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. But obviously lots of people do want to come sort of as more of an activist. And then obviously you do want to be persuading people, not just sort of being interested. And so I think going into a conversation with the motivation, I'm trying to persuade someone of my position, but I'm also willing to have my mind changed, is probably the kind of effective way to bring these two attitudes together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Look, I think I'm just a hippie at the moment. Like I'm a real hippie at the moment in that I believe in the transformative power of human connection. And what worries me about so many things, whether it's social media or, as you talked about, the way in which, the fear of social ostracism is sort of wielded to sort of get people into line. What worries me about all of these things, all of these attitudes to communication, is that it makes that human connection less possible. Right. I think that people can be persuaded by real life contact with real life people, but that goes two ways, right? It's always a two-way process. And what worries me about, the way in which things are contested, not just on social media, but I suppose in any mediatized form, is that it makes that human connection less and less likely because you're under such a feeling of threat.
We're going to have to wrap up quickly because Harriet, who's our stand-in researcher today, is looking after my dog in the next room because her other owner is away and I can hear her barking. So I need to check everything's okay. Ash, it's been a pleasure speaking to you this evening.
Wait, can you hear Harriet barking or Moose barking?
No, the dog's barking. Harriet's not barking. I'm sure
Okay,
she's
right.
fine, but I do need to check what's going on. But thank you so much for watching. I'll be back on Monday. Have a fantastic weekend. You've been watching Novara Live. Good night.